Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Good afternoon for all and very morning to our colleague, Professor. I would like to express our gratitude and honor to welcoming Professor Wim van der Stede from London School of Economics. As we know that he is one of a very prominent accounting professor in the world. In this session, Professor van der Stede is going back to important topics in management accounting research, which are scenario presentation and selection of innovation project, as well as E to Z research publication. I'm not going to talk much about scenario presentation and selection of innovation project because this is beyond my expertise, as you know that I am an HR person. But from that, I understand that a research work on this area should provide a clear understanding that a decision on innovative project selection are a key to our firm success. In this workshop, we will also elaborate how accounting information has a pivotal role in affecting this success. Another topic which I personally interested very much is regarding the issues and strategies in research publication. I believe there will be some hints and tips on how to expedite this research journey by Professor van der Stede, from selecting a good conference, networking, until how to handle with difficult reviewers' comment will be elaborated. All in all, I surely believe that this event will give important benefit to all professors, lecturers, professional, PhD students, master and final year undergraduate students. I also would like to express my appreciation to all of you who generously help us make this event come together to become a success. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. I need to leave some time for Pak Fuad and Professor van der Stede for this event. Although this is approaching iftar, fast breaking maybe for us, and I believe we are all still going to have fun. Thank you, Professor van der Stede. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Pak Dekan. Thank you very much, Prof. Okay, now it's my turn to introduce Prof van der Stede, and I'm not going to talk much about his academic achievements. He is, as Pak Dekan just mentioned, that he is one of the most prominent professor in accounting. He is, I'm going to say this honestly, that he is one of my personal heroes, and I came to know his work since 2000. His earlier works in accounting, auditing, and accountability journals, accounting, organization, society. In 2000, his works on the budget emphasis, like corporate and business unit strategy. I kept track of his works, and his research was, very interesting to me. That I did the same research for my first research. I did the same research as his. And I really enjoyed his work, and then I just decided I want to be a lecturer during that time, and now here I am, and the lecturer because of this. And that is my personal, my personal issue. And from his professional side, Prof van der Stede is very prominent, that he is one of the recipients of the AAA notable contribution to management accounting literature, and he is the president of management accounting section of the AAA, and so on and so forth. And he also works closely with the professional bodies as well as the professionals as well. And he appears regularly at the academic and practitioner conferences. And his book, Management Control Systems, that some of you use his book with Kenneth Merson, right? Is very, very interesting as well. And I think I'm not going to say all his achievements, and I strongly believe that you all know him very well, and in fact you know him better than I do. I think that's all from me from my introduction, and we are going to hear Prof. Van der Stede discussing his research work on scenario presentation and selection of innovation projects. Very heavy materials, yet very interesting, so much to learn. And also, if time permits, we are going to discuss research publication strategies as well, right, Prof? Yeah, I think I also would like to say hello to my colleagues from many universities in Indonesia. We have actually more than 500 registrations. But since this is almost close to the breakfasting, they would like to have the recording version of this. And also some friends, colleagues from Malaysia, from Australia as well join this event. Thank you very much. Prof, without further ado, time is yours, and my apologies if there is any miscommunication or if anything. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's really an honor for me to be with you, be it virtually. The introductions are humbling and very much appreciated. One thing I would say, which I think hopefully will come across the two presentations, is that you have to do these things with a passion. And if you do them with a passion, and then you develop your skills, then I think you're at least contributing to the generation of knowledge and to potentially practice as well. But I will reserve that for the second part, those sorts of comments. But I do hope it will also come through in the application of a specific research paper that I am currently involved with, which is the scenario presentation and the role of that in the selection of innovation projects. Now, I have set aside 2 hours till about noon here in London, 6 o'clock Jakarta. We'll see exactly how we carve up the time. I'm happy to be interrupted for questions at any time, but my hope is to set aside at least half an hour to 3/4 of an hour for sort of the general research and publication comments that you have asked me to make as well. Okay, so now give me just a short moment to try and share my screen. Share. And now I need to have that presented. Now, swap. Okay. Do you see my full screen or the notes screen?
Full screen.
Full screen. Okay. So you see the full title slide. I am here. You see my mouse move, right? And this is with colleagues from IESE, which is a top business school in Spain. I myself at the London School of Economics, and the 2 other colleagues are at the Erasmus School of Economics in the Netherlands, where I am also a visiting professor. Now, one interesting thing to note about this project, the other colleagues, and so as I was introduced by Professor Suharno Nomo, this is as much about, everyone hear me all right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I will carry on, and if there was to be any technical issue, please do notify me as soon as possible. If I don't hear anything, I'll just assume you see and hear everything correctly. Okay. Fuad, if you could, if there are questions, if you could alert that to me, because it's very difficult for me to also keep an eye on the chat. So if you could alert me to any questions and perhaps pose it to me, then that would also be appreciated.
All right.
Okay, I have the usual agenda. I'm not going to spend time on that, but let me try and first put the research project in its broader context. Some of my own research, perhaps maybe even the majority, has been about the decision influencing role of accounting. That is how accounting through incentives influences employees, managers' behaviors. So the decision influencing role has probably in recent decades received the most attention because of its sort of performance measurement and incentives angle to it. Now, this paper is about the other role that accounting can play in firms, which is the decision facilitating role. This is what kinds of information help managers make decisions, as opposed to what kind of accounting information influences their behaviors, right? So if you measure revenues as opposed to profits, you get a different response from employees and managers because of the decision influencing role. But that is not what we are speaking to in this paper. We are speaking to the decision facilitating role. What kinds of information and the way in which it is presented has which effects, okay, on important decisions that managers make. And so what we are focusing on is financial information in scenario or non-scenario form, and how that affects innovation selection decisions. And innovation selection decisions are very important for firms. There's a large stream in the literature in management that shows both the upsides and the downsides of innovation, and how some firms sometimes are made or broken by making the wrong decisions along those lines. I mean, Apple is obviously a very important example in that whole literature. Okay, so decision facilitating versus decision influencing. This paper is about the decision facilitating side. Okay, now financial projections. I would think that most of the many participants in this seminar would not disagree that financial information, accounting information, plays an important role in most decisions in organizations, not just for-profit firms, but also non-profits and public sector organizations. But this is focused here on for-profit firms. But that is not to say that accounting information is the only information that is important. And particularly in an innovation context, you could see much non-accounting information being very critical as well. But again, in every research study, and that may be a point that I come back to in the second part of my presentation today, you need to be able to position your research within the bigger picture, okay? But at the same time, you also need to have a particular focus. So what are some elements of the focus that I have already elaborated, okay? Decision facilitating as opposed to decision influencing. Innovation context. Obviously, innovation decisions are very important decisions, but they are, again, not the only important decisions that managers make. Okay, but that is the type of decision that we are focusing on. And then accounting information, not to say that accounting information is the only important information, but once again, that is the type of information that we focus on. And then the final cut to sort of my positioning of this specific paper into the wider context is that the form of presentation of that accounting information, of those financial projections, by way of scenarios or not, will have predictable effects on these innovation selection decisions, right? So decision facilitating, innovation context, financial projections by way of scenario presentation or no scenario presentation. And the way in which the scenario presentation matters, okay, and can have predictable effects on innovation selection decisions is currently poorly understood in the literature, has not been well documented. Okay. Now, as I will say in also the second part of my presentation today, it's not because something is not so well documented that therefore it is worthwhile studying. Something more than it just not having been done before is required. But the question is, firms look at innovation projects. The financial projections, this is one form of a projection that sort of many projects typically have. In the initial stages, you sort of have negative cash flows, and then if the project takes off, then there is commercialization and the revenues come in, and then sort of it progresses towards maturity and the revenues begin to taper. Okay, the question is, when you look at an innovation, right, can you be so convinced and so persuaded that you indeed only have this, seemingly quite accurate projection of the future cash flows? Or is it more reasonable to expect that there will be a range, because after all, innovation is very difficult to get your hands around. Any innovation, although later we distinguish certain and different types of innovation, uncertainty involved. So maybe there could be a future where things have a better outcome in terms of cumulative cash flows. That's the best case. And a not so great outcome, which would be the worst case. And then, of course, you can also have this range being wider or narrower. Okay. Now, what is important is that these scenarios represent plausible futures. They are not wild guesses. They shouldn't be, but they are also not indicating that there is a clear and one only and perfectly predictable future cash flow. And so now you can start thinking as to, if someone was to appear before a panel that selects innovation projects, giving the impression that there is such a certain future, would that be credible? And if you believe, and we'll talk about this later, that this isn't quite credible to even pretend, and therefore not very persuasive, very compelling, then of course the person being asked to make a judgment about your innovation project with the aim of selecting it or rejecting it may have a diminished view of your expertise. The innovation selector may also believe that there must be risks involved in innovation, yet these risks are not shown. So there is ambiguity which is not being expressed. So the risk is not being disambiguated. So you could, and that is a little bit along we theorize, that we formulate our hypothesis is, surely the way financial projections are being presented, i.e., without scenarios or with scenarios, and perhaps even wider or narrower scenarios, small or large range scenarios, will have some effect on the perceptions that the innovation selector, the innovation decision maker, may have about such things as the innovation team's expertise and the innovation project's risk. Now, again, there may be other things that it affects as well, but in our study, our two key variables on which we believe the presentation or no presentation of scenarios of the financial projections will have an effect is the perception by the innovation selection decision maker of the innovation team's expertise and the innovation team and the innovation project's risk, right? And then the next step is, if the view of the team's expertise is favorable, would you think, would your prior be, would your hypothesis, would your prediction be that is more likely to lead to an acceptance of a project rather than its rejection. And I think one could argue, expertise is probably expected to have a positive effect on the ultimate selection decision. Whereas risk, right, a high perceived risk is probably going to have a predictable, and we'll see if we find empirical support for that, negative effect on the project selection decision, right? So if I may summarize, we have accounting information in the form of financial projections in an innovation selection context. That accounting information is presented by way of scenarios or not, right? Is that form of presentation having an effect on the perceived team expertise and the perceived project risk? And if it does, how does that feed through to the innovation project selection? And as I was introduced today by the Dean with this presentation, clearly firms making good innovation selection process decisions is very important. And so the way that leads these decisions to be made well is equally important. Hence, the importance of the decision facilitating role of accounting in the important decision of innovation selection in firms. Okay, now I think what I have just done hopefully allows you to understand or perceive or appreciate the importance of articulating your research. It ends up being about something quite specific, but it needs to fit into a broader framework. And that's what I have spent time on so far. But then there is a second thing that as a researcher, you have to try and be confident about, or be certain about, or definitely want to know the answer to, is how relevant is this subject that I am researching to the ultimate consumer of my research. And the ultimate consumer of my research is not necessarily the journal editor, but the practitioner, right? So if in practice no one would have any worries about whether or not to use scenarios, then what am I really researching of potential practical relevance, right? So in other words, is there some debate about the usefulness of scenarios in practice? And there is, okay? And here you see me cite, not the academic literature, you see me cite the respected business management periodicals like McKinsey Quarterly, okay? And in those articles, I did find that presenting scenarios is a good thing because that allows the decision makers and also the team understand the risks of the project and be more confident about their project, right? It's about future cash flows and much else besides. There is uncertainty. By thinking about these scenarios, you are not making believe and yourself believing that there is this point estimate of the exact outcome of the future cash flows that this project will have. No, there is some range around it, and you try to hone that range narrower or more wide. And that will depend on the information that you engage and the research that you do and the depth with which you elaborate your project and convince eventually the selector to hopefully go with it. So it's a positive thing, okay? It exudes confidence. It is persuasive. It makes it credible. It is more compelling, okay? These are terms that I'm using. But things aren't really interesting if sort of we only see that it is a good thing. In other words, are there no downsides whatsoever to using scenarios? Well, and there are. And again, you would find these in commentaries of practitioners in respected journals. And I will also show you some other sources where I've tried to answer this question, is this worthwhile studying? Well, yes, it's worthwhile studying because some believe it's a good thing, but some also believe or could be a bad thing, or not all of it is good. Because surely if you're presenting scenarios, it's going to look like you haven't done your homework. It may look like you are prevaricating. It may look like you should have done more research, but you didn't. Because had you done it, you could have clearly been more convincing about the outcome that your innovation project will have. And if you can be bothered to tell me that, then why should I bother to approve it, to select it? Isn't that interesting? On one slide, I give you arguments why I say some would believe that presenting scenarios increases the chances of your project being taken as credible and acceptable and therefore being selected. But that is not necessarily the only view that one could have about this, because it might also be seen as a sign of weakness, not having done your homework, abdicating leadership, ownership of your project, leaving it open to the future, to let it be what it may. Abdication of leadership. That's interesting because there is tension. Okay, there is a puzzle. It is not so that all of us on this call would unanimously agree that scenarios are a good thing. Okay, and that's what you also want in your research. You want to have degree and find a degree of tension. But I find it even more, and I would urge all of you to always do that, okay? Is there a bit of controversy about this? So if you look at a study published in a very respected journal, the Journal of Financial Economics, but a very descriptive study about the theory and practice of corporate finance. And among many descriptives that are in this study, one was also about the use of scenario analysis. And they found, I'm going to simplify here, that about half, okay, of the sample firms, and it was a large sample, use it always or almost always, and the other half never or infrequently use it. So if you look at firms, and if this is somewhat a representative firm, then you won't find scenario analysis in this case, slightly broader than a scenario presentation in the innovation context that we are specifically talking about in our study. But you won't find this used by all. And that's good, because that means that some firms who use it hopefully have good reason to use it. And those who don't use it, well, they may not know what they miss. That is a possibility. But surely some of the half who don't use it will have made a deliberate choice not to use it. And therefore, they must have good reason not to use it. And therefore, as a researcher, you know you're onto something because you have both firms that use it because they have good reason to use it, and other firms who don't use it because they don't have good reason to use it. So that immediately then for the researcher triggers the questions, what is the variation in context, in reasons, in predictors that make scenario analysis, right, effective in certain organizations and not in others, right? Here you have even some more evidence. So Bain & Company is a consultancy, and they do a survey, I believe annually, of the 25 most popular management tools. And that includes balanced scorecard and benchmarking and Six Sigma and total quality management and things like that. 25 popular management tools. And they find that the average, it's the average or the median. Now I don't recall exactly. It's the mean, yeah. The overall mean is for any of these to be used by about 30%. Okay. And scenario planning is used, the mean for its use is 20%. So this actually means that scenario planning is not as widely used as sort of the averagely used most popular management tool, but it's still in the top 25 of most popular management tools. And again, it gives a bit of tension. There are enough who find it important to use, but there are also some, for some reason, who can't be bothered, right? And firms and organizations usually can't be bothered because just they are unawares. They have reasons why they are not using it. And so again, that leads us to having to develop theory as to what these predictors of use might be. And then the third one is in our own study 2, right, which is part of our own data in this paper. In some of the survey of the participants that we did, and they're all practicing managers, okay, we find that in innovation project teams, about half use scenario presentation, okay? So in the academic literature, we don't have too much research focused on the question that I am focused on. That is good. But it's not good if the reason for not focusing on it is simply because it's not interesting. So you need to ask yourself the next question. Is what I am doing interesting, stroke, potentially relevant? And I have given you definitely some evidence, right? Why there is reason to believe that the use of scenario analysis and presentation in practice is debated, is prevalent in its use, but mixed. Some do, some don't. Yet it is prevalent enough for it to be worthy of study, because across of all of these sources, the lowest incident of use is sort of like 1 in 5 firms using it as a popular management tool. Is there a question? I'm happy to pause. Okay. If there is, Fuad, please interrupt me, okay?
Sure. Yes, Prof.
Excuse me,
Okay.
Professor van der Stede, maybe please, it is very interesting for me, but I haven't got any information why this research is not focusing on how to present the scenario. You're only focusing on the usefulness of scenario. You argue about the usefulness of presenting scenario, while not trying to move forward how to presenting the scenario. I think it's very, very important issues for this research. Okay, thank you very much.
And I will come to that, because one of our hypotheses, one of our theory is not just about or not presenting, right? Which is sort of, and I totally agree with you, the evidence, quote unquote. You know, this isn't hardcore evidence even, right? This is just to get a sense of the practical relevance of what we are on to. But now the next question is, should we, and then how? I think I spotted the how in your question. And we speak to that, but again, I'm not claiming necessarily comprehensively, but to one dimension of it, which is by way of narrow or wide scenarios. And we actually do feel that has an effect. If you wanted to, and I don't know if I understood you correctly, yeah, but still, why is the emphasis on presenting? Well, presenting is also been shown in other strands of the accounting literature as having mattered, having been consequential for the decisions that either analysts or managers make. So in the analyst literature, there have been studies of the effects of presenting analyst forecasts as a point estimate or as a range. That's an example. In the balanced scorecard literature, which is in management accounting, there has been research as to how managers respond to how certain types of information in a balanced scorecard is presented and where it is positioned. Okay, so that's another piece of evidence. And there has also been some research in the financial accounting area, whether or not it matters if information is in the body or the footnotes, say, of the financial statements. Now this, for the person who asked the question, is not directly relevant for the question that we are researching, but it helps argue that the way financial information is presented matters. And so, if I may make another recommendation or suggestion, it's not just enough to say, oh, this hasn't been studied before. You also need to have a sense, I think, of the practical relevance. And I have done that. And the person who just asked the question says, and I agree totally, that's not enough, because then you have to start thinking about, well, how is the thing that you are researching going to affect what it is you are interested in? Point well taken. But it is also not so, and I sincerely believe this, there are very few things, if any, that we don't know anything about yet. We always know something. We always have something to go by. And so if your question was, why presentation? Well, I've mentioned the analyst literature that has looked at the effect of presentation in their context. I have mentioned financial accounting research that has looked at presentation and the placement of information, say, for example, in the footnotes. And I have also mentioned studies in management accounting of the balanced scorecard type that looked at the way the information is being presented and placed within a balanced scorecard affects the decisions that they are interested in examining, right? So I'm very pleased with your question. Now, having done all this, which is still all very broad, right? The bigger question, narrowing on the specific study. Oh, has there been much prior research on this? Not too many. It's still poorly understood. But that doesn't make it necessarily, therefore, important, unless it's also relevant in practice. But it's not because there is very little known about this specific question that I'm interested in. There is something known about the effect that presentation of financial information has on certain types of decisions in vastly different contexts that I am going to study, right? But nonetheless, providing substantive support for it being worthwhile examining. Okay. I hope I answered your question. So what we're interested in is now back to the specific, okay? Should project teams present scenarios, right? Does that affect expertise of the team and risk of the project? I've already talked about that. Aha. Now I come also to a little bit of your how. Does that vary by whether the project, the innovation project itself, is of a different type? In other words, would your answer be the same in their effects if you look at a core innovation as opposed to a transformational innovation? And definitely on the how of the question that the person just asked, does it vary? I mean, is it just about scenarios or no scenarios? Or is it about also the range of the scenarios? So that is, I think, the complete set of things that we are carrying with us in our study, which is a reduction of all the things that this could be about, but I feel, and I hope I have succeeded, can be properly motivated both in the academic literature, by the practice literature, and with respect to prior understandings that presentation of information can be consequential for decision making. Okay, I'm not going to say, because I want to keep an eye on the time as well. There's, of course, many stages of innovation that you could focus on studying, okay? But we really focus on the project selection. But again, a little bit in the spirit of the question that has been asked, that doesn't mean that other research hasn't focused on other stages. And to be frank, in accounting, if you look at accounting and innovation, right, you will actually find most accounting research addressing the earlier stages of innovation, the use of accounting in R&D settings, okay? And what the general drift of that research is that, and it's sort of confirming the naive prior, right, is surely accounting and innovation don't go together very well, right? Accounting is about structure, about control, whereas innovation is about creativity, right? And so there have been some studies by the likes of Tony Davila and others that look sort of at the use of accounting in R&D and innovation context. But what we are looking at specifically is presentation of financial projections in scenarios on the project selection decision. And that is sort of located here, okay, in this funnel of innovation as it manifests itself in firms from concept development to implementation, right? And of course, here, when you look at post-implementation, we have many studies, of course, because that is almost accounting in a more operational context as we know it and as we teach it in the terms of cost of goods sold and variances and cost analysis and contribution margins and things like that. So we are neither here, okay, nor there. We are specifically there, okay? That's our studies focus. Okay, I've already shown this graph. Then you have the scenarios around it. Aha, the how, right? Assume, and I'm going to qualify this finding, that we were to find, right, that scenario presentation is a good thing, right? Is it a good thing unlimitedly? In other words, can you present any scenario and it will be a good thing? Or will it only be a good thing up to a certain point? And actually our finding is, and I'm going to give it away now, simplified, okay? There's more to our findings than what I'm going to say now, but we do find actually that small range beats no scenarios, right? But large range does not, okay? And small range beats large range. Okay, I'm going to qualify that. There's a few further tweaks to that finding. But scenario presentation usually, if I may simplify, okay, our findings, presentation, but it does only do so when it is contained to scenarios with a relatively narrow range. With the wide range, you start to have no longer a positive effect, possibly a negative perception of the team's expertise. And I guess you can see why, right? Yeah, well, we understand that the future is uncertain, but if they can't hone it down to a reasonable range, then maybe they haven't done their homework, right? It starts to reflect negatively. And here you can maybe see why as well. The wider the range, the more likely that the worst case, as is shown here, is actually showing a loss. And we know from behavioral theories that there is a negativity bias. So if you are presenting an innovation project and the worst case is a negative, a loss, then that is likely to disproportionately draw attention to it, which may have a effect on the perception of the project's risk, a negative effect on the perception of the project's risk. So you could see in the wide range adverse effects, right, on team expertise as well as project risk, from scenarios that just have too wide a range, and therefore are no longer more effective on the outcome of the project selection than no scenarios, and definitely small scenarios, right? And I do think, hopefully for the person who asked the question, that that gives you a sense that we are speaking to the how, right? Okay, perceived risk is one of the key dependent variables. Perceived team expertise is the other. Okay, I've already, yes?
Yes, you mentioned that there is an assumption that you made regarding the strong link between the risk and uncertainty, risk and ambiguity, I mean.
Yeah.
There is a research that clearly differentiates between the risk and ambiguity, and they expected utility function cannot be used when the firms are faced with high non-probabilistic uncertainty, in this case ambiguous environment. Will this lemma holds, or will this lemma applicable to your research, Prof?
I mean, it's always, I've presented this several times, and that is always the difficult thing to answer, because I think we sort of endogenized risk. I mean, first of all, it's the perceived risk, right? We're not measuring the exact risk of the project, right? Because again, we are looking at the behavioral response to a way of presenting financial information. And so if you look here, right, if you look at the wide range, and this is a transformational innovation, what we are interested in is not necessarily the real risk of the project, although, Fuad, I agree with you totally, that risk of that transformational project is higher than the risk of a core project by definition. Actually, we have endogenized it in our experimental design like that, because the probability of the cash flow realizing in the transformational is only 20%, and in the core it's 80%. And again, that was modeled based on real life projects in Alcatel-Lucent Bell. So yes and no. But my answer is actually one of admission, is that we cannot, as some of these analytical studies that you are referring to, separate risk and ambiguity explicitly. That is an admission. Does it matter? Okay, I think that was your second question. I believe not, because we are not measuring the exact relationship between the risk of a project and whether or not it gets selected. We are measuring the relationship between the decision maker's perception of risk and his or her selection decision. And importantly, Fuad, is, well, is it because the risk is higher or lower? No, it's because we find that systematically, when you use wide ranges, the perceived risk is higher than when you use narrow ranges. And we have allowed both core projects to have a wide range as transformational projects in their presentation, okay? And we have also allowed transformational ones have a narrow scenario presentation, a wide scenario presentation, and no scenario presentation. So that is exactly the 6 combinations that we are studying. Core, transformational, no, narrow, large. But that is distinct, Fuad, from the actual risk that the project has, right? So I do think you have a point, but I also think, and that's an admission, okay, but I also think that in a sense, we are not studying the relationship between the actual risk of a project and its propensity to get selected. We are studying how the presentation of a project with a risk, right, is perceived differently depending on how the presentation of that project is done, i.e. through no scenarios, narrow range or large range, and how that affects the selection of the project. right? But I find your question really intriguing because it also keeps me wondering, right? But I think what I hope will help us overcome it is that we let every project, regardless of its true risk, be presented in any of three ways, right? And it's how the selector responds to that, okay, that has a systematic relationship with their decision to select or not. Now, we cannot know what's in the actual selector's head estimation of the actual risk of the project is, but then you need to look at our research design, and our research design is an experimental one. So we would hope that that is one of the things that gets randomized out, right? Right. So there is both, I think, an analytical point, which is where you started. Then there is, okay, but that is not exactly the relationship that we're studying. So that's where I would urge you to keep focused on presentation. And then there is a dimension, yeah, but what does the person who makes the decision really think the risk is? Well, that is something that our experimental design randomizes, because the systematic variation is captured by the 3 times 2, right? The 3 ways of presenting for the 2 types of innovation, right? And I will come to that later, Fuad, and please feel free to revisit that question if I would not have, okay, perceived risk, perceived expertise. 2 projects. Here, again, I'm gonna be very frank with you. Any typology is one of sort of extremes, right? So you can read what we mean by transformational. You can just think of it in your own head, what that means, as opposed to core. Core is more incremental. Transformational is more revolutionary. But just like with any typology, think, for example, of strategy typologies, right? Like a cost, leadership, and differentiation by Michael Porter. There are surely things in between, right? And the world doesn't so nicely categorize itself. But if I may now refer back to sort of my answer to Fuad, we do an experimental design. So we can sort of stylize these 2 types of innovation in sufficient differentiation from one another that we can measure the distinguishable, the systematic effect, right? So that's okay. So here you have transformational and core. Fuad, it's a little bit related to your earlier question. You know, in the core, we have a expected cumulative cash flow that is much lower than that of a successful transformational innovation. But of course, the odds of realizing that success is a lot lower for transformational than it is for core. So in that sense, I think we have the usual sort of risk-return view of the world embedded in our construction of these 2 types of innovation. Okay, here I'm going to spend not too much time because I have done a lot of it already. Okay, does scenario presentation have an effect on the perceived project team expertise and the perceived project risk? We hypothesize it does. We hypothesize that the decision maker will feel that teams that present scenarios exude more expertise, because that there is certainty, they have engaged with that uncertainty, they are persuasive, they are credible, they are more compelling, a positive effect. Now, in terms of the risk, we also believe that it will disambiguate. You are not pretending that there is no risk. You are actually putting bounds, right? Borders, limits, by acknowledging that there could be a worst case and a best case. So that is definitely going to reduce the perceived risk by disambiguating it. I know, Fuad, you know, that's a tricky sort of difficulty here, because there is, after all, a true risk of the project, right? But that is also not known by anybody, right? And then we have the second bit, which is, if scenarios have this hypothesized good effect, by enhancing team expertise and reducing project risk, is that unlimited? You know, does any scenario has that effect? Maybe there is a difference whether or not the scenarios are presented in small, narrow bounds or in large, wide bounds. And so we have hypotheses about that. It's like, well, when you present scenarios, you show your expertise. But if you present scenarios that are so wide, it may start eroding your expertise, because rather than compelling the decision maker that you've done your homework, it's going to look like you don't know what you are doing, right? And on the other end, I've already graphically illustrated that, you get the negativity bias. If the range is so wide, you are likely that the worst case will be negative, and therefore you may introduce a negativity bias or trigger a negativity bias where there is a disproportional focus on the worst case, and therefore a risk enhancing rather than a risk reducing perception of your scenario presentation. Okay, and then the third one, and this is a moderating effect, does this vary by type of innovation? And we hypothesize that it does. Imagine, and I've already referred to that with Fuad, if you have a core innovation, and let's now simplify what we understand by core, okay? A very incremental sort of innovation. If that would be presented to you with wide ranges, would that leave a good impression on you? No, because we are operating sort of within the same customers with a known product to which we do some tweaks, hence incremental core innovation. And yet you, as the team presenting that to me, are leaving the range of outcomes so wide that it makes me wonder whether you are really going to be in charge of that project, and therefore it is going to negatively affect my perception of your team expertise, and of course either make me wonder whether you have no control of the risk or whether the project is so risky that we should stay away from it, right? Even though it is a core project. Whereas for transformational, there I think people could be more understanding and therefore accepting, and therefore seeing it within the realms of expertise and risk if that were to be presented with wider ranges. Okay. And then we believe that expertise is a good thing for the project to get selected. Risk is a bad thing, right? A negative relationship. But here we have also a dashed arrow about which we don't theorize, but we do believe that if you are selecting a project that you may see a risky project, but have a lot of content in the team, you may be willing to accept a risky project. And so we are also testing, actually controlling, because we're not hypothesizing, but controlling for the possibility that the effect of risk on project selection is moderated by the team's expertise. Okay. And so that is, I think, sort of our theoretical model. What did we do? We did exploratory interviews in different countries, but of the same company, which was Bell Labs, Alcatel Bell Labs. Then we did a first conjoint experiment with managers, so not students. Okay, and you can see the detail of the description of all that in the paper and its web appendixes. Then we did a second one, in part to validate the findings from our first one, but to also add something. We made the context slightly richer by introducing strategic merit of the project and not coming back to the how question that I was asked earlier. Is it scenarios or no scenarios? No, it probably is also the range of the scenarios. But another thing that may matter is the sense that the decision maker has in how these scenarios were being established. In other words, intuitively or analytically. In other words, sort of more as guesses as opposed to a result of thorough analysis. And so we take these additional variables with us in the second experiment, and FWAD, we allow in the second experiment actually the transformational project to have a slight advantage in terms of the risk-return equation. So we actually allow its expected cumulative cash flow not to be just equal to that of core innovations, but to be higher. And the last thing that we allow to happen in the second experiment is, managers select projects, right? But in the first experiment, we only allow them to select or reject. In this experiment, allow them actually to make no decision. So neither, you know, so and that is also a reality in firms, right? And then finally, when we have done all this, we go back to the field in 4 countries, again, strongly related to our contacts in Alcatel-Lucent-Bell labs. And we did 5 interviews initially to sort of corroborate our findings and try to make sense of them as executives themselves, experienced executives see it. And the +6 is in red because between the original moment of the paper and now we have done 6 more. Okay, so I unfortunately I cannot explain what that really is. There is a YouTube video where you can look these things up yourself as well. But basically, conjoint means that you make the experimental subjects take a decision between 2 choices. And those choices have embedded characteristics. And from the choice that they make, you can then empirically infer the experimental subject's preference of these characteristics, because it's their choice, right, that must have made it more desirable, and therefore the characteristics that are represented by that choice must all have been more preferential for the experimental subject. So basically what we do is, well, we have 2 types of projects, right? You see them here, core and transformational, FWAD, right? And we have 3 ways of presenting about them, using no scenarios, small range scenarios, and large range scenarios. So from this, we can construct 2 times 3, 6, right? And then 6 projects you can combine in 15 pairs. 6 times 5 divided by 2. And so we present these pairs to the experimental subjects and they make a choice. And it's from that choice that we can then make inferences about the desirability of scenario versus no scenario, small range versus large range, moderated by core or transformational project type. Right? Now, we do a lot, of course, to make sure that these choices are not subject to the participant getting tired. So we randomize these choices. We also flip the order from time to time so that you don't have a built-in fatigue kind of effect. And for these 6 projects, we are also asking every experimental subject to then rate each of those, right? In terms of their perceived project team expertise and perceived project risk. So the company that they have to familiarize themselves with is Telforce Limited. And then every time they get to see 2 projects amongst which they have a choice. So clearly you can see this one here is core because it has the lower expected cumulative cash flow. And this one is a transformational because it has the higher one. Clearly here there's no scenarios, right? Whereas here there is scenarios, but these scenarios are a small range. which is 4/3 of the expected. Now, so now as an experimental subject, you need to make a choice. So you need to click this button or that button. And by making that choice, we can infer, that's why it's called conjoint experiments, about core transformational, no range versus scenario, and then small versus large, right? So no range and small range, and then the expected value is the same. In our second experiment, we allowed the expected value of the transformational to exceed that of the core, right? Bang, the next choice that they're making, although this is always randomized, okay? The right can be the left can be the right, and this is the second for one subject, but is the last for another. So complete randomization. I mean, it's been quite interesting to develop these conjoint experiments in that way. But what you see here is they're making a choice between two transformational, but one of the transformational, is presented with a large range where you see the negative as the worst case appear, and small range where the worst is still in the positive range, right? And then they need to rate the perceived risk and the perceived project team expertise. So familiar, right? You've seen this before. What does it mean empirical? Well, we manipulate type of innovation and scenario presentation. No, small, and large. 2 types, transformational and core. 3 times 2, that's the 6 projects that we have, right? So that is our basic manipulation. Then, of course, we measure for each of these 6 projects, the experimental subjects' perceived project team expertise associated with that project, and the perceived project risk. And then we observe, right? We observe whether that project gets selected or not, right? So you've seen the theoretical model. Now you see how we operationalize it in terms of what we manipulate, what we measure, what we observe, and also what we control for. And I'm not going to go into detail, but we control obviously for a large battery of possible alternative explanations that would make our results. Here is then the econometrics, and don't be impressed by this, because it is a so whether scenario, remember, right? Whether scenario presentation has an effect on the perceived team expertise. Okay. In every regression, in every equation, you have a constant. Okay, that's here, the intercept. Well, what is the effect of scenario? Aha, that's in beta 1, because beta 1, right, times scenarios, right? What is the effect of innovation type? Aha, that's in beta 3, right? What is then beta 2? What is that? Well, that is the coefficient of the interaction, the multiplication of innovation type and scenarios. Aha, what is that? That is the moderator effect. That is, in other words, how the effect of scenarios on team expertise is moderated by innovation type. In other words, beta 2 is to test these hypotheses. These arrows, right, is this interaction, innovation type and scenarios. So we have an intercept, we have the effect of scenario presentation, we have the effect of type of innovation, we have the effect of the moderation of the effect of scenarios on expert by innovation type, and then we have a coefficient for our series of controls variables. Of course, we have not just one dependent variable, which is the perceived team expertise. We also have the perceived project risk. Everything else, same. The only thing that you may wonder is, what is this funny new thing here, right? Because in a normal regression, you would just have the beta coefficient. Why do you have this new here? Well, remember that every experimental subject makes 6 judgments about a team expertise, because we ask them to do that for every of the projects. So core, no scenario. Core, small. Core, large. Transformational, no. Transformational, small. Transformational, large. Our 3x2, 6 times. So actually, for every experimental subject, we have a distribution of their estimates, right? Which makes it a statistic, right? Parameterized here by the new. And so rather than a simple estimate, we have a distribution. And so this new, right, accounts for that. That is also known in the literature as random coefficient models, right? You understand random coefficients because you have a distribution. Also sometimes known as hierarchical linear modeling. Again, don't be put off by this. The simple thing is, there's an intercept, there's an effect of scenarios, there's an effect of scenarios moderated by innovation type, there's also an effect of innovation type on its own as a main effect, and there is an effect of the controls, right?
Yeah.
And then we
Professor,
have...
may I?
Yes. Yes, please.
Yes, a question. Thank you, Professor. I do agree with Fuad. It's heavy, but thank you for the explanation. It's like a peeling onion, and thank you for the explanation, including this model specification. I got 2 questions here. First is, in the last phase of your study, you are using interview. You mentioned on your paper that interview around the respondent. And my question is there any new insight from the interview? I mean, in terms of practical sense, in terms of practical, a new insight from the interview. And secondly, decision-making, facilitating, the facilitating role in decision-making, it's quite new for me. And this is the example of using this concept in a study. Maybe you could elaborate more the concept of a decision facilitating role for accounting. Yes. Thank you, Professor.
No, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. First part of your question, I wrote it down so that I don't forget, is did we learn something from the follow-up interviews? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Okay, but did it only just confirm what we had found, or that we had also sort of already discovered? Because remember, we also did sort of pre-exploratory interviews. If I may do a bit of a self-compliment, okay, this is a study that I think has a large sample element to it through a robust, but nonetheless method with its own limitations, i.e. those experiments, but not just one, 2. The second, not just doing what the first one did, but trying to enrich, so both replicate and incrementally enrich. Now, these experiments were not just drawn up from our offices. No, these vignettes, right, of these projects and these ranges, 4/3, 16/3, were based on 31 projects that we had scrutinized in a real life company, Alcatel-Lucent-Bell, right? And so I find doing studies like this a lot of fun. because I think you are not just subject to weaknesses of external validity. You cannot be too easily accused of not having experimental realism because you base your experiment on these exploratory interviews. And you are also then, and now I'm coming to your question, not just let your results hanging be what they may, even though our results quite nicely support our hypothesis. So we have theory and empirical evidence to be quite matching. But yes, we still did learn from the senior executives in the follow-up, and this study does not have too much of that because, again, we did 6 more recently. We did find 2 things. One is some corroboration that actually our findings are as they are also experienced in practice. Okay, so if I may give an example, one of our key findings is that narrow ranges have these positive effects, but wide ranges pretty much ruin it again. Okay, and we have some very nice quotes from those senior executives which we interviewed ex post, okay, that really, oh yeah, well, you know, if you see a team come up with these wide ranges, then your prior is that they haven't done their homework, right? Phrases like this. So, clearly scenario presentation is not a good thing across the board. There are limits on it. We actually did find this in our conjoint experiments, and I hope I have a little bit of time to show you those results, right? But that was also very nicely corroborated in the follow-up interviews. And for the person who asked the question, not because we showed them our study, not because we probed them, but from sort of the unstructured, semi-structured follow-up interview, it was clear that was something that was recognized as a problem with scenario presentation. They are good as long as they are kept honed. They become bad again if you let them rip. Okay. But what we, I wanted to give you another example of something that we found is, okay, so if that is the case, we found, but then what do you do about it, right? And one of the key findings was from the follow-up interviews, but we don't want to overplay these because they don't have the same generalizability as our experimental findings have, was, well, as a decision maker, right, you have to always try to, and I'm using the exact quote, okay, level the playing field among your innovation project teams. And so what that meant when we probed that further is that actually you can give teams, okay, tools and set expectations such that they are not falling in the trap of presenting scenarios that will almost kill their project. And so what are these tools? Well, giving them resources to allow them to do more market research. And one of our ex post findings is that there is a positive correlation between firms that are above median in their use of market information and intelligence and above median in their presentation of narrow scenarios. And we, the person who asked the question, would never have looked at that correlation had it not been sort of suggested in an ex post interview. So scenarios are good as long as they are good, i.e. they sort of become bad when they become too wide. Okay, but then what do you do? Well, clearly firms can provide means to their innovation teams to establish better scenarios. Oh, what are those means?
Well, giving them resources and access to data, information, market intelligence, access to prior project proposals, right? As sort of templates and examples, set expectations. And then, because of this insight, but we don't call it generalizable. It's an interesting question for future research, right? We actually then looked at, oh, is there a relation between firms that seem to be more resourceful in their market intelligence and the coincidence of small range scenario presentation? And lo and behold, there is. Okay. Now I use the term coincidence and not causal from this study. How can firms affect the process through which innovation projects are presented such that they are more likely to select the best available innovation projects? And the person who introduced me today did say that is probably a very important decision for firms. So what we are showing in our study is that scenario presentation makes a difference, but now the next question is, how can you make it make the difference that actually improves the selection decisions? But for the person who asked the question, and many of you know me through my work, I am not going to overly speculate, because I do think that that is the next interesting research question that needs to be rigorously examined. Okay, does that help?
I think so.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Professor, thank you.
And there are definitely more of these sort of post interview findings that are interesting, but I would call them interesting rather than necessarily robust or generalizable. But there are, yeah.
Yeah, one follow-up question, very short, very quick. Is it possible to use the, let's say, the core transformation as a proxy for, let's say, for the risky or for the probabilistic uncertainty, while for the transformational innovation is a proxy for the ambiguity? Can we make that assumption?
I think the assumption is hard not to be present. But again, Fuad, what we don't do is we don't just do transformational with wide range. We do transformational, which one could assume has higher risk. But if that is presented as a certain outcome, i.e. no scenarios, presented as a manageable sort of range of outcomes, i.e. narrow range, or presented as a wide range of outcomes, i.e. large range scenarios, is it that variation that affects the decision maker's project risk? And so, yes, I mean, I'm not going to go back to my slides because I have animation and I have to click away like a madman. But you have seen before, right? The transformational have an expected cumulative cash flow of 30 million and the core of 7.5. But the 7.5 times 0.80% of realization gives you the same expected value as the 20% of the 30 million.
Right.
So far, I really like your question. I would under no circumstances wish to say that there is no difference in risk in these projects. We also not trying to make it seem like there is no difference in risk, but we randomize it away because we only, and I've shown that very nicely in my model as well, right? What we manipulate and what we measure And what we manipulate is that, well, a project that someone can assume has a large risk, i.e. transformational, which is your point. Well, but what happens if you present it as looking like it has no risk? Or what happens if you present it as having contained risk? And what happens if you make it look like the risk is indeed, right? So I'm somewhat confident that because we are not trying to persuade anyone about the differential risk of the project in 3 different manipulated ways, right? That it is that effect that we are isolating through its manipulation and therefore measuring in terms of its effect.
Thank you, Prof.
I'm still confident that we actually do that. But it's a very interesting point that you are raising. Okay.
Thank you, Prof.
Let me do some key results from the first study. Okay, what do we find? If you look at small range, that has a positive effect on the perceived team expertise and a risk reducing effect in terms of the perception, okay, that people have about the project, as you can see here, and both are significant, okay? We don't find that for large range. Actually, for large range, we find it to erode, reduce the perceived project team expertise and increase rather than decrease the perceived project risk. And this, for the person that asked the earlier question, we got some interesting quotes about through these post-study interviews. Okay, so small range beat no scenarios in terms of their positive effect on perceived team expertise and their perceived project risk reduction effect. But large range do not beat no scenarios. Well, the question is, what about, yep. What about the comparison between small range versus large range? And we see that small range, okay, beat large range in terms of their positive effect on team expertise and in terms of their negative effect, therefore their perceived risk reduction effect. Okay, so from that, small range are better than no range, and small range are better than large range, and large range are actually poorest of all. I think that's a very interesting result, okay, and a robust result across our 2 studies. Now, coming back to the how question, right, that was asked a little bit earlier, okay, does this now matter depending on the type of project you are using this for? No scenarios, small range or large range. And again, don't be too affected here by the little arithmetic that you have. What we needed to do is to code the transformational effects code as +1. For transformation, minus 0.07, because this is effects coded as -1. And now you need to really do a test to see whether that reduced effect is still significant. And I can tell you, you know, and we do it in the paper, it is, right? And then for transformational, no, for, yes, so small range for transformational, I've done all the computations. Small range for core, I've done this one, right? 0.16 minus 0.07, and that remains significant, and therefore our hypothesis is supported. But let me take another one. Let me take transformational and a large range. So we already knew that large range had a negative effect on the perceived project team expertise. How does that work for transformational, right? Well, it's minus 0.11. It gets mitigated by 0.06, so it remains negative at minus 0.5. So for transformational projects, presenting large range scenarios keeps having a negative effect on the perceived project team expertise. Okay, so that is how you have to work this out. And then the next question is, does it affect the selection? And we do find that perceived project team expertise has a positive effect, and perceived project risk has a negative and significant effect on project selection. So if I were to be normative, and I don't want to be, I mean, you know me well enough as a scholar, right, that I don't want to be normative. But to help you have a takeaway, okay, from this research, then one of the conclusions based on this experiment is that small range scenarios are beneficial in terms of the effect on the perceived team expertise and perceived project risk for both core and transformational projects. Whereas large range scenarios either leave us stranded with an insignificant effect or a negative effect. In other words, it doesn't longer help the eventual project selection, because large range have a team expertise reducing and a project risk increasing effect rather than the other way around, right? So that is the key findings. And being in the interest of time, I'm going to conclude, because we also did a second experiment. And in the second experiment, we made some tweaks. We allowed the transformational innovations to have, for example, a higher expected return than the core innovation. We reduced the number of choice sets using de-optimality. That's all described in the paper. We made the decision-making context a bit richer, right? Does it make a difference if the decision maker knows how the scenarios were being derived intuitively versus analytically? And does it make a difference if the project is sort of a standalone project or whether it is strategically important? And in the literature, they call that strategic merit, right? And so that leads us to needing to do an in-between experimental setup, because we now have two ways of deriving scenarios and two types of strategic merit, right? And then we have the results, and these results largely corroborate our findings, right, from the first experiment. And that takes us to some implications and takeaways. And I think this is the biggest one. And then I'm going to let you take a look at this. I will read it, and then we're going to move on to the second part of this session, which is where you can ask me questions about publishing and relevant research and things like that. But key takeaway for managers and firms: presenting small range scenarios increase the perceived expertise of the team and lowers the perceived risk of an innovation project. Right? Yet, presenting large range scenarios may backfire, right? Because they increase the perceived risk and may decrease the perceived expertise. And then for future research, the question is, here, for the person who asked the question, right? In these follow-up interviews, we got some interesting quotes about that, right? Small range signals that project teams have done their homework. Large range signals that the project team is dreaming, you know, and leads decision makers to fixate on the downside and ignore the upside. Right, and we have more of that, and actually more of it than is in this paper, because remember the red +6, right? This paper only still represents sort of the smaller set of follow-up interviews that we did. I would like to leave it at this. I hope this was interesting, and I actually, if you don't mind, expressed a lot of the things that I think you should be doing when we get to the second part of the presentation, which is when you do research, just don't do it because no one has done it before. You have to have some sense, by way of some of the things that I have illustrated, that you are onto something that is of interest to practice. Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly, you should not just read the academic literature, you should also read some of the better practice literature. And for me as a management accountant, that is the McKinsey Quarterly and the Harvard Business Review and some trade journals, you know, FM magazine and things like that. But if you are in auditing, then they have similar sort of trade and practice. So you need to know your institutional context, because nothing is worse than speaking with results to something that you cannot contextualize, because it will also not allow you to get the practitioner interested in your results and therefore to demonstrate the relevance to them and therefore to want to know about your research results. But it's not just about relevance, because we also want our work published. And so what you do needs to be rigorous. And I hope, and I'm not going to self-promote and self-sell, that this study that I've presented surely is not perfect, but has many hallmarks of rigor, right? Multiple approaches, 2 experiments, experimental realism, to try and not just have internal validity, but also some external validity, exploratory interviews, ex-post interviews, articulating the managerial implications, as well as the theoretical contributions. Because I was very happy with an earlier question when someone says, yeah, but why are you interested in presentation? I'm not the only one who's interested in presentation, because presentation has also been studied in analyst reports, in balanced scorecards, and in annual reports, for example, right? Whether information is in the footnotes or not. So both the scholarly literature and the practice literature, rigor and relevance. And hopefully I have also expressed what I think is the most important thing, is that you are passionate about what you're doing, that you want to know, right? That you are not saying, oh, I want to find this. That when you find something, you say, how could I possibly prove myself wrong? How could this story be richer, right? And there's a little bit of that in this paper as well, because scenario presentation, I cannot now tell you, always do scenario presentation. The only thing I can tell you is when you do scenario presentation, you probably need to do it quite analytically, reduce your range, so that rather than reducing the perceived project risk and enhancing the perceived expertise of you as the presenter, it backfires by having the opposite effect, right? So it depends. And the magnitude of that effect varies by whether you are presenting a core or a transformational innovation project. So institutional context, relevance and rigor, and passion. I think those are the 3 things. I don't have slides for my second bit. I do have slides if you want it, but I would rather leave it sort of with these points and now take questions from you with respect to anything related or unrelated.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. There is a question from Bu Vena, and he sent it directly to me. And he asked whether there is a trade-off regarding the internal validity of your research and the complexities of your experiment study. How you deal with this issue, Prof?
Well, you need to acknowledge that that is a trade-off. It will always be a trade-off. It couldn't be anything but a trade-off. Because the moment that an experiment becomes perfectly externally relevant is when it would cease to be able to be an experiment, right? But consciousness about all of the trade-offs that you make is very important. When you do an experiment, it's between internal and external validity. When you do a survey, you may have a bit of a leg up on external validity, but you may begin to have some measurement problems, right? Because it's all very perceptive. Okay, so how do you deal with the trade-off? Well, in my example, in my case, I did not one experiment, but I did two. But I didn't just do two to do two. I did two to both replicate and extend, okay? And in both of the experiments, well, the first more than the second, because if I wanted a bit of replication in the second, I couldn't change everything from the first, right? So you have to have enough commonality, but not just commonality. Again, it's a trade-off again that you're making. But for the first experiment, neither of us, the four co-authors, did sit in their offices and say, let's think about a vignette innovation project. No. We had access to Alcatel-Lucent Bell. We were allowed to look at the 31 projects that they had been evaluating themselves internally over the most recent period. And so we studied these inside out to model our experimental vignettes on. So when we say narrow and broad, it's not something that we just came up, oh, let's take 4/3 and 16/3. No, it was actually based on sort of the range that we saw being used in Alcatel-Lucent. So we know that experimental design is about internal validity, but by giving it as much experimental realism, right? By having your experiment based on a real setting, that helps. When I do a survey, well, you can generalize perhaps a bit more easy because you can draw on a larger sample, but you begin to suffer a bit from maybe measurement problems. Well, to the extent that you have some measures that you can corroborate against objectively available data. So maybe the managers in your company have given a self-rated performance answer to a question about their business unit's performance. Well, maybe you can correlate that with objective information that you get either through proprietary data from your sample, or if they are publicly traded, you can perhaps correlate with, say, publicly available measures of performance. Now, these are just examples, but my answer is two things. You need to be conscious about the trade-offs because there always are trade-offs. There is no trade-offs. It's impossible. But be conscious and then try to make the trade-off to become less influential. Not eradicate, because you won't be able to, but less influential in affecting your results. And so experiments, you can do with a bit of replication by having a higher degree of experimental realism. With surveys, you can do an additional sample. You can have a combination of self-rated information and objectively available information. Some of that may be available through an internal database, other may be available through publicly available sources. And if you look at some of my work, not all of my studies have had the luxury of going as far as I have in other studies, but some of my studies do. So this paper, I think I've given an example. My study in management science has elements of survey data, proprietary data, and field site interviews, field study elements. So yeah, do what you can, be conscious, and then try to mitigate the effects of the trade-off. And lastly, do not overstate. So know the limits of what your study can do. That doesn't mean you have to belittle your own study. That doesn't mean that your study cannot have a very persuasive and strong takeaways, but be somewhat measured in too bland generalization to settings where, well, your study really hasn't spoken closely or rigorously enough to. Yeah, so those are my 3 elements: conscious, mitigation, and then careful inferences, generalizations, short of speculation.
Thank you. Silakan Bapak Ibu, ada pertanyaan saya diajukan langsung ke Prof. Van der Stede. Any question? You can ask Prof. Van der Stede directly, or you can send a private message to me. Silakan. Okay. Okay, I also received a message from a colleague of mine states that in some journals, there are some sort of, how to say this, some sort of very strong networking, you know, among the colleagues. So perhaps this gang published in these journals and those gangs, I mean, those colleagues published in those journals. Is that true, Prof?
I think it's an observation, but not necessarily a manufactured, intentional one. I mean, networks, I guess, matter, but everyone obviously has a focus. So I am, say, an empirical management accounting researcher. I have employed a few more methods maybe than other ones do. And so now assume you are of a certain type, and you are that type because that's what you are best in. And so then there are journals that publish good work without any bias. But if they publish certain types of research, then it becomes also attractive for other ones to submit the type of research there. And because that journal will also have the set of reviewers which can evaluate that research. And so what I would say is clusters, and sociologists have studied this as networks, small worlds and islands and things like that. They have names for that. Are what we observe, right? But they are not necessarily manufactured. They are not just chumminess. They are not back scratching. They are not, we are publishing each other's work. They are actually because there are several factors that determine what type you are, including your PhD, your supervisor, the method that you are most prominently used, the source discipline that you commonly draw on. And so if you just look at the 3 that are my favorite, right? Topic, method, and source discipline, right? Well, you can maybe see that certain combinations of these right? Certain favorite topics, studied with a certain method, looked at it from a given angle, right? So say management, experimental method, management accounting research that is economics based, right? You can surely observe clusters of that type of work overlaying certain journals, but I don't believe that this is sort of a fabricated result. I think it is a consequence of individuals coming at that research with a strength in a combination of those three that sort of ends up then catering to a journal that also has an overlap with that kind of a cluster, right? Now, so I don't believe it's just networking for networking's sake. Of course, it is important, I think, for us to present our work. And again, where are you likely going to present your work? Where there are people with whom you are likely to have something in common, right? And so some people are more minded to go to certain conferences. And so there may again be a certain clustering. And then if you present at this conference and you get some good comments, that may allow you to improve your paper. And the improvement of the paper through this presentation process may increase its chances of getting published in a good journal. So I think it's not a managed or the result of a deliberate chumminess, coziness, networking alone effect. I think there are many factors that make these clusters an observed outcome. And that has to do, I think, with another trade-off, if you'd like, specialization versus generalization, right? So there's only so many literatures that you can really be versed in. There's only so many methods that you can rigorously apply. There's only so many background education that you can have enjoyed, right? So whether you are trained as a sociologist or an economist, locks already a lot in. It doesn't mean that you can't be an open-minded scholar, and I would encourage you to be an open-minded scholar. And I would encourage to read outside sort of your stream of education and method. But nonetheless, it is going to lock in some of your possibilities by virtue of us all being limited in how much exactly we can absorb and handle and know and study and research and be expert enough about. Yeah, so I hope that that explains.
Yeah, it explains a lot. Thank you very much. Mr. Unggul, Pak Unggul, you have any question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor Wim. Professor van der Stede, it's been a pleasure to have you to listen your sharing experience and your paper presentation as well. There are a few questions for you. My first question is about the choice of the design, of the research design. For instance, based on your paper in regards to scanner representations, I would say, for instance, it might be possible to conduct the research by conducting the ANOVA or multivariate analysis of variance, for instance, to test the trade-off between the long-range scanner and short-term scanner in terms of the effect to perceive team expertise and perceive risk, for instance. So what do you say about the what's your suggestions in terms of how we select the appropriate design or the appropriate data analysis method for our research paper? And my second question is in terms of your position as a management of accounting research chief and editor, Professor van der Stede. So what would you like to say, or what would you like to suggest us in terms of what's the most important elements that we need to consider when we would like to submit our paper to MAR. What is your suggestions? What should we concern about the most relevant part? Okay, thank you for your answer, Professor.
It's a great pleasure. You're very welcome. In the interest of time, let me answer the first question, the choice of design. I think in the end, a study can only sort of handle, well, one primary method, although I have given examples of my own work where we have multiple methods. But even the study that I presented has multiple methods. The primary method is the experimental findings, okay? So I'm not going to oversell this as a multi-method paper. No, this is a conjoint experimental paper. Now, again, I know this has limits, and so I have tried to mitigate those limits by having pre and post and by having experimental realism. But this subject could also be interestingly studied with other methods. Maybe, and we have not ruled this out because you have been able to infer from this paper that we have some good contacts in some firms to whom innovation matters, right? Alcatel, Lucent, Alcatel, Bell Labs. Nokia is one of the former ones that also got absorbed into this. So if we were to get access, which we already did to some extent to those 31 projects, but if we were to get, say, multi-year data with variables that we can justify from the literature or interesting right-hand side variables, independent variables, then we could do sort of like the multivariate analysis that you describe, and we could code the projects by whether or not they use scenarios, small range, large range. Rather than us manipulating it, we could measure the width of the range, etc. But we have not had that access to that kind of data. But that would then be sort of a retrospective analysis because you know the outcome, but you don't know the counterfactual. That would be the limit, right? So you don't know what could have been decided had someone else decided on another day looking at the same information, right? So that is the advantage of our experimental subjects, because that is the bit that we can randomize as opposed to the bit that we manipulate. But nonetheless, that would be a study that I'd love to do in this context. And then there are other ones, maybe some among you who say, well, this is really interesting. I would like to know how firms deal with innovation in Indonesia. And that would then smack to me as, in the first instance, as a rather descriptive study. But you need to then find what is descriptively wanting to be known. So that might be elements of the difficulties that managers face in selecting projects, right? Don't they have enough information? Do they have too much information? Are their teams, their selection teams, not composed of the right individuals? So that would be a study that may be amenable to survey research, getting deeper into understanding the difficulty of making selection decisions, right? Now, that is an example of research design. Now, what about MAR, right? Management Accounting Research. I do think, I mean, MAR is highly reputed. We are totally open to any and every subject that is related to management and accounting and control, okay? But for your paper to stand a chance in the review process, it needs to have the characteristics of a complete paper, meaning a good literature, a good motivation, a good positioning in the existing literature, and then an adequate method. And I'm open to any method, okay? And MAR has published interpretivist type of research, sociological-based research, economics-based research, analytical models, survey research, experimental studies, you name it.
How about the change, Professor? How about the change between qualitative and quantitative?
Yeah, the chances are, with most journals, vastly higher to get rejected than to get accepted. But what I was trying to speak to, and it's probably in the same realm as
I mean, in terms of qualitative studies and quantitative study, how much to change?
No difference. No difference on the basis. Because what makes the difference is whether the study is executed rigorously. So if it is a qualitative study, it will not get rejected because it is a qualitative study. It will get rejected because the reviewers may not be convinced that, for example, the inferences that you are derived from a qualitative study are warranted. They are not robust enough. And I will not have that judgment be made by someone who has never done a qualitative study. That study will be evaluated by someone who is known and an expert and will fairly evaluate the rigor of that method. And that comes back a little bit to sort of the cluster point that Fuad raised earlier, right? I would not send a paper like that to reviewers that have no sympathy for that method. And any expertise to judge that method well, right? So I'm happy you asked this question because there are no predetermined ratios of types of research that I seek to publish, nor are any types of research handicapped by virtue of the type of research that they are. But it must be within the scope of management accounting research, which is your variables. And I'm not saying that in an econometric sense, your phenomena, your theory, your findings, your variables, your motivation needs to be put in a management accounting and control context. You need to have a well-motivated question and then rigorously executed. As an experiment, if it's an experiment, as a field study when it's a field study, as a survey when it's a survey, as a critical study when it is based on sort of the critical interpretivist approach. It needs to speak to the correct theories as economics based, but equally to the correct theories when it's sociology based. Right? So yeah, no, please, I'm very happy you gave me the opportunity to say that nothing is a priori, right, prejudiced by virtue of what it is.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, bro.
Thank you.
One last question.
Excuse me, Prof.
Okay, Pak Dwi Cahyo.
And
yes,
Vice Rector. Who asked you about how to why not focusing on how presenting, because I was trained as a grounded theories student at that time, and then I read a lot about sense making, in decision making, I think, and one of accounting information is part of sense making process in decision making. And I think I still is curious about your as a experimental methods. Is it possible? My question is it possible if you only put on small and long range about the process? Is it possible to combine about the sense making into your process of experimental method in this time of study?
Yeah. And I think actually no, and the reason being that experiments are not equipped to get under the skin of the decision maker, right? That's the bit. Right, we measure their response to the manipulated bits, and sure there are some that make sense differently than others, but we have large samples, right? You've seen it, right? What is it? 745 in one study and 1680 in other. So, you know, whether you are sort of thinking highly of risky things or more risk averse, I mean, and of course we have some control variables about these things as well, right? Gender and risk preferences and numeracy and education and things like that. But no, my answer to you is it's a very good point. It relates to an earlier point. It's like, you know, which method to use. If you were really interested, I think, in sense making, then you almost would have to do, I think, a Mintzberg type of study where you try to be part, action research type of study, where you try to be part of maybe selection teams and companies, or where you have an opportunity to observe them, or at least if you don't have the opportunity to observe them in action, where you have opportunity to go through the documentary evidence of their processes. And then you would engage with different literature also in the front end of your paper, right? Because you would be quoting Weick, and you would be quoting management and organizational theory scholars. And I think this would be very interesting. But our approach in this study is not equipped to speak to that. And so I don't, and I acknowledge that, because I feel if I would want to speak to it, I would be speculating. I would be attributing findings from my study that are beyond what my study can do. And that's why I think there is need, definitely, to more studies. Some of these things you can build into your implications for future work, for example, right, at the end of your paper. But I think it's important that every paper has a good motivation for what it does, is able to place it somewhat in a bigger question, right? Then executes rigorously, makes inferences only to what the study can speak, and then at the end, judiciously try to relate back a little bit to the bigger question, right? And in doing so, offers implications for future research and avenues for further studies. And so there's trade-offs all along, but that's a reality. And it's very important to be conscious of these and to sort of stay within the limits of what your method, your as a prior person says, your choice of design is really only equipped to legitimately speak to. Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Actually, there is a direct message sent to me regarding the sample selection issue, whether it should be done or no. Simple question, yes or no, Prof. Sample selection bias test. Should we do this or no?
Well, yeah, there is no simple yes, no. For survey research, yes. Yes. For us here, less, because we have a good description of what our respondents are, right? And we have sort of weeded out those who didn't meet our criteria. But that limits the generalizability again to some degree, right? Yes, so external validity is a bit of a weaker point, right?
Right.
But external validity is very important for survey research, and that's why definitely there you need to do sample selection bias tests, because it's hard to generalize from your sample if it is systematically biased, right?
Right. Okay.
So that's my yes.
Thank you very much, Prof. Actually, we would like to have a lot more of your time, but definitely this is impossible. Anyhow, we greatly get so much from you. We learn a lot from you, Prof. We definitely learn a lot. And I do believe that 250 something, 260 audience also feel the same as mine. I also would like to invite you, if this pandemic's over, to visit Semarang, Prof, to visit Undip, to visit Indonesia. And there are so many things to explore here. And just let me know the time and then we hope we can, you can visit Semarang, Indonesia here.
Yeah.
And have you ever been to Indonesia, Prof?
No, I have not. I've been to
No, you
several
should.
Asian countries. One of my favorite cases that I teach is the Citibank Indonesia case study.
Okay.
It's on target setting and budgeting.
Right.
But let me reciprocally say how humbled I was by the very generous introductions you made for me, how pleased I am to have had the opportunity to present. And I definitely hope that there will be a time, hopefully in the not too distant future, that we can again travel safely. Yeah. And if that takes me to Indonesia, then I would be very happy to. So yeah. Reciprocally, very warm thanks from me and to all the participants.
A lot. Thank you very much, Prof. We learned a lot.
Okay.
And thank you all to the committee from the KMA. Thank you very much. And to all the audience, thank you very much as well. Please contact me shall you need further information regarding the recording and the materials of Prof. Van der Stede. Terima kasih semuanya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.